General Weidling was announced to Hitler and immediately admitted to the briefing room. I waited in the large outer chamber with detailed maps that Weidling might need. The bunker smelled damp, and the sound of the small engine that ran the exhaust system provided a constant background noise. The ever-present Martin Bormann accosted me again. I had one of Bormann's sandwiches and filled him in on the battle that was being waged above ground. After about 45 minutes, the meeting in the briefing room ended. Hitler emerged, followed by Dr. Goebbels, General Krebs, General Weidling, and some other people. I saluted, and Hitler walked toward me. As he neared, I was shocked by his appearance. He was stooped, and his left arm was bent and shaking. Half of his face drooped, as if he'd had a stroke, and his facial muscles on that side no longer worked. Both of his hands shook, and one eye was swollen. He looked like a very old man, at least 20 years older than his 56 years. Weidling presented me to Hitler. "Major Knapper, my operations officer." Hitler shook my hand and said, "Weidling has told me what you are going through. You have been having a bad time of it." Being accustomed to saying "Jawohl, Herr General," I automatically said "Jawohl, Herr." And then, realizing that this was wrong, I quickly corrected to "Jawohl, mein Führer." Hitler smiled faintly, and Goebbels smiled broadly, but Weidling frowned because his subordinate had made a social error. Hitler said goodbye, shook my hand again, and disappeared in the general direction of Goebbels's quarters. Although his behaviour had not been lethargic, his appearance had been pitiful. Hitler was now hardly more than a physical caricature of what he had been. I wondered how it was possible that in only 6 years, this idol of my whole generation of young people could have become such a human wreck. It occurred to me then that Hitler was still the living symbol of Germany, but Germany as it was now. In the same 6 years, the flourishing, aspiring country had become a flaming pile of debris and ruin. Weidling and I left the bunker through the basement hallways of the Reich Chancellery. We had found a safe passage through the basement all the way to a window facing Hermann-Göring-Strasse. "Did he approve the plan?" I asked with trepidation. "No," Weidling said angrily, "but it was the way he did it." This man whom I had seen remain calm under even the most adverse circumstances was so furious that his voice quivered. He listened to my proposal, and then he said, "No, Weidling, I do not want to risk dying in the streets like a dog. Our soldiers have been dying in the streets of Europe for the past 6 years at his command. For him to imply now that such a death is somehow dishonourable is loathsome." Weidling was so angry that he was throwing caution to the wind. If someone had overheard and reported what he had just said to me, his life would have been in very great danger. But our men had been dying in the streets of Berlin every day and every night since we had arrived in the city, and they had died in the streets of other cities before Berlin. For Hitler to be so disrespectful toward the men who were sacrificing their own lives every day just to keep him alive one more day filled me with anger also. Many men who had served under my command had died since the beginning of the war. My own brother had died for Führer and fatherland. No wonder Weidling was angry. We had both been in the war from the beginning, and we had both seen countless deaths in our almost 6 years of war. As soldiers, we had accepted death, even our own, if it came as a natural part of our lives. We accepted it as a price we had to pay for a cause we had thought just, at least in the beginning. We were perhaps only now, at the last possible moment, beginning to see clearly what kind of man we had been following. When I reported to the Führer bunker the next day with the daily situation map and saw Hitler going from one room to another in the bunker, my hand moved involuntarily toward my pistol. I had a terribly strong urge to kill him and stop all the suffering. It would have been easy to do, since he had no personal bodyguards inside the bunker. I would not have got out alive, since SS guards were at all the entrances and exits, but I could easily have killed him. Certainly it was not fear of death that stopped the movement of my hand to my pistol. With the escape plan out of the question, my fate was sealed and unavoidable. The Russians had been shooting captured German officers following every battle in their march across Germany. My life would undoubtedly be over in a few days in any case. In the instant I had to make a decision, I must have instinctively concluded that I should not risk making a martyr of Hitler and possibly creating another Dolchstoßlegende, stab-in-the-back myth. By late April, we no longer had any chance of defending Berlin. The horrible, hopeless battles in the streets continued, but our divisions were little more than battalions. Our morale was poor, and our ammunition was almost gone. Theoretically, we had 4 divisions with which to defend the city, but in fact the divisions were at less than half strength, and that included many wounded. By including Hitler Youth and Volkssturm, we may have had enough bodies to man 4 full divisions, but the Volkssturm was staffed by old men, and the Hitler Youth was composed of children, although some Hitler Youth were somewhat effective in defensive positions. Even if we'd had 4 fully staffed, experienced and rested divisions, we were still a corps fighting 2 army groups, and on top of everything else, we knew we would receive no more ammunition. Being outdoors in the city was becoming more dangerous, because Russian tanks were now driving around the city, German tank hunter groups were chasing them with Panzerfausts, and both were shooting wildly in all directions. To go any place in the city now meant darting from cover to cover, from doorway to doorway, climbing over and around the piles of debris and the decomposing bodies that littered the streets. When a soldier walks over and around, and sometimes inadvertently on human corpses daily, his sensibilities start to numb. I was beginning to wonder if we could still be called human. The loud roar of combat filled our days and our nights. We could usually detect from the sound what kinds of weapons were being fired. Mortars sounded slow, artillery shells were a little faster, and heavy artillery was much faster. Of course, the detonation of heavy artillery was much louder than that of light artillery and mortars. We could also tell the direction a shell was coming from by its sound, and we could tell by the sound whether it would pass over our heads or hit in our vicinity. After a while, our senses were automatically tuned to these sounds, and our reactions became instinctive. We still had not given up on the idea of breaking out of Berlin. It was obvious that a breakout could succeed only as long as we could get to the Pichelsdorf Bridge without heavy fighting. The divisions urged us to begin the breakout soon. The morale of the men leaped when they learned about the possibility of a breakout. Weidling kept urging Krebs to press Hitler on the subject, but Krebs said that Hitler could not be made to change his mind. Hitler's refusal frittered away precious hours and days, while the Russians constantly reinforced the ring around Berlin, especially to the west of the city. April 29th, the Russians were less than 500 meters from the Reich Chancellery. I could hardly steal a full hour of sleep. There was always work, reports to receive and consolidate, orders to write, instructions to give, maps and sketches to draw, phone calls to take and make, and endless other details to take care of. We learned that Wenck's 12th Army had been beaten back conclusively, and with that, any hope for a military change was gone. Everybody now wanted to place hope in a political change brought about by increasing friction between the Western Allies and the Russians. But could that be of any help to us at this point, even if it happened? Weiss, Freytag Löringhoff, and Bolt answered this question in the negative when they left the sinking ship during the afternoon, through the subway tunnel and across Lake Wannsee, to carry Hitler's last will and testament out of Berlin. However, they did not mention anything about their plans to me, even though I talked with them daily. I learned about their departure only after they had gone. At Bendlerstrasse, individual members of the staff who had no immediate job to do were having parties, dancing on the volcano, so to speak, with the women auxiliaries for signal duties. It was a relief to me to again submerge myself in my work. In another area, a feverish activity developed. Everybody wanted to take advantage of being so close to the personnel department of the Supreme Command of the Army to get bigger decorations and even a promotion. Von Dufing was promoted to Oberst at this time, and he surely had earned it. but other promotions were given very generously now at the last moment. Decorations, too, were processed rather quickly if they were related to bravery in the fight for Berlin. Several times I saw 14- and 15-year-old Hitler Youth members pick up their iron crosses for destroying Russian tanks. Weidling was considering trying the breakout on his own if Führer headquarters did not want to come along. It was a difficult decision for him to make, however, and he could not quite come to grips with it. We had almost given up any hope of getting out of the rubble and debris that was now Berlin, when suddenly on the morning of April 30th a call came from Führer headquarters. One of the cables actually was functioning for a change, requesting that I come over immediately and report again about the time calculations of the breakout plan. I left immediately. Through the springtime foliage of the Tiergarten, the shells burst without interruption, destroying everything in their immediate vicinity, and small arms fire was everywhere. Blinding sunshine lay over a gruesome scene. On the lawns of the Tiergarten, under mutilated age-old trees, I could recognize artillery pieces, all put out of action by direct hits. The gunners who had not made it were lying around, so mutilated they were hardly recognizable as human remains. Everywhere in the streets the dead were visible among the piles of dust-covered debris. Empty shoes lay here and there. I remembered the first combat dead I had seen in France so long ago, and how shocked I had been at the sight. Now my sensibilities were so numb that a corpse was little more than an obstacle to step over. In those moments when I paused to catch my breath or to let a salvo of artillery shells get over with, I could see in gruesome detail the outlines of a human torso, or part of one, between fragments of bricks, rocks, and concrete. However, I could not let such observations distract me. I had to try to get in one piece across Hermann-Göring-Strasse with my papers. Maybe Hitler had decided after all to make the breakout. This time I did not have to endure Bormann's courtesies. General Krebs was waiting for me in the Führer's conference room. I laid out my maps and made another presentation on our intended breakout. Krebs then asked a lot of questions about the details of our time calculations. He was especially interested in the amount of advance notice that had to be given to the divisions before the beginning of the operation. I told him that we had everything prepared so that we could start tonight if the order went out this very moment, but that 14 hours of start-up time was required. A quick decision was necessary if the breakout was to be successful. Tomorrow night could be too late. Krebs indicated that Hitler was still opposed to a breakout, but Krebs wanted to try again to change his mind. We would hear from him about the results, so all our hope had been for nothing. He had not even approached Hitler about it. With a very heavy heart I returned to Bendlerstrasse. The hours went by without anything happening, without word from Führer headquarters to dispatch the code name to put the divisions in motion. Then it was noon for tonight, it was now too late. And tomorrow, perhaps, it would be too late altogether. Still, the front was holding firmly almost inexplicably. Why did the Russians insist on attacking at all the most difficult places? Across the Spree River at the Charité Hospital and across the Landwehr Canal at the Lotzerufer, at Potsdam Square and in Leipziger Strasse, where General Monke's SS units defended the immediate surroundings of the Reich Chancellery. The Russians apparently wanted to conquer the Reichstag and the Reich Chancellery as quickly as possible. It was lucky they did not know that the easiest way would have led them very quickly and directly to their goal. Each time I drew a new situation map, it was a puzzle to me why the Russian General Staff could not recognize that. During April 30th, the Russians captured the Reichstag and then concentrated on the few hundred meters to Führer headquarters against fierce resistance. General Monke's SS troops and the remnants of our 56th Panzer Corps were defending the bunker valiantly. Even though their own deaths could be the only possible result of their continuing to fight, still they fought on. At about 7 p.m., an aide of General Krebs arrived with an order for Weidling to come with a small working staff to Führer headquarters. Whatever that might mean, it was a change, and there was hardly anything now that could make things worse. Weidling decided to take von Duffing, a clerk, and a liaison officer along. I was to stand by and follow the next morning at the latest, with the latest situation map. At around 6 a.m. on May 1st, Major Kirsch, our liaison officer with General Monke, arrived from Führer headquarters. He reported very strange things. Incredibly, Weidling was apparently being held there against his will, under something like house arrest. I took my maps and set out again on the horrible trip to Vossstrasse, as Weidling had instructed me before he left. In the conference room of the Chief of the General Staff of the Army, I met Weidling, von Duffing, and the others from our staff. Weidling somehow looked completely different. Something had happened that had thrown this man, who could not be discouraged even in the most hopeless situation in battle, completely out of kilter. Weidling informed me quietly that Goebbels had told him last night that Hitler, after first marrying Eva Braun, had taken poison together with his wife and shot himself. None of us had known about Eva Braun before, but now it occurred to me that she must have been among the women in the bunker whom I took to be secretaries. The corpses were rolled in carpets, drenched with gasoline, and burned in the courtyard of the Reich Chancellery, so that they would not fall into the hands of the Russians' Goebbels had Weidling come to the bunker so he could continue leading his troops from there. I was stunned. For some reason, it had never occurred to me that Hitler would commit suicide. If he planned to commit suicide, why had he not done it long ago, when it was obvious that the war was lost? Why had so many people had to die so senselessly, right up to the moment the Russians were knocking on the bunker door? Such selfishness was unbelievable to me. Goebbels, as the highest Reich minister in Berlin, had taken command, and apparently was afraid that Weidling might take action on his own. Weidling told me that he was not free to leave the bunker, and advised me to try to maintain my base at Bendlerstrasse, so I would not be restricted to the bunker as well. He said he would try to get the agreement for the breakout tonight. He told me that the night before, von Duffing and Krebs had gone to the Russians to explore the conditions for a surrender. Both spoke Russian. But the Russians had insisted on unconditional surrender. Von Duffing then told me the details about his trip across the front lines. After Hitler's death, Krebs had immediately got in touch with the Russian command by radio and asked whether a German delegation could cross at Wilhelmstrasse to talk to them. Krebs, who was a former military attaché in Moscow, walked with von Duffing along Wilhelmstrasse, partly through the subway tunnel. They were received by Russian officers and driven to General Chuikov's staff headquarters. Although their conduct was correct, the Russians were adamant in their demand for unconditional surrender and for extradition of Hitler, whose death was not yet known to them, Goebbels and all other non-soldiers responsible for the war. The next morning, Krebs gave his consent to begin the breakout during the night of May 1st. Weidling gave Refior the order to issue the code name to our divisions. It was now too late for a massed, centrally led breakout in one direction, so breakouts were to be made individually by each division, beginning at 9:30 p.m. Weidling also gave each division commander and each soldier the choice to either join the breakout action or to go into Russian captivity. In talking with General Major Monke, Weidling and I learned that SS Brigade Monke intended to leave at about 9:30 p.m., gather at the subway station at Friedrichstrasse, and break out in a northerly direction. Weidling decided that our corps staff would join this group, and he instructed me to have our corps staff personnel ready to leave Bendlerstrasse at 8 p.m. We would, of course, have to fight our way through to the Reich Chancellery in order to join Monke's group. The Reich Chancellery personnel, or those who were left, also intended to join this group. Krebs and Bergdorf decided to stay and take their own lives. During my walks through the Reich Chancellery this day, I saw wounded people everywhere who were being cared for by Army medical corpsmen and by Red Cross nurses. SS men were helping themselves to such delicacies as canned sausages and soda or beer. It was obvious that the end had finally arrived. Plans were being made now by individuals rather than by commanders. At 7:30 p.m. I sat down to a last supper, with all those from Hitler's immediate entourage who were still present in the Führer bunker. I was probably the only outsider in the group. Sitting around a large table with me were Martin Bormann, Admiral Voss, a liaison officer representing Admiral Dönitz, Ambassador Hewell, a liaison officer representing Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop, and 4 or 5 women whose identities I do not recall but who must have been secretaries. There were also 2 or 3 other people. We had tea, army bread, corned beef and canned liverwurst. The conversation, of course, was about the forthcoming breakout through the Russian lines. Since I was an experienced combat officer and therefore an expert in this group, I was bombarded with all kinds of questions. The appearance of the group was unusual, because all were dressed for the breakout. Fat Bormann could hardly have been comfortable in the regulation enlisted man's uniform he wore. The Admiral and the Ambassador also wore enlisted men's uniforms. Even the women were dressed in army uniforms. The attitude of the women was fatalistic. Whatever happened could not be helped. Hitler was dead, and that was almost more of a shock than they could handle. They had all been with him for many years, and there. Minds were probably now blank with the inability to cope with what was happening. During this meal, at about 8:00 p.m., Dr. Goebbels came in with Frau Goebbels to say goodbye to the Reich Chancellery staff. One of the secretaries whispered to me that Goebbels's children, who had still been running around in the bunker in the afternoon, had already been put to death. The attitude of Frau Goebbels was very composed under the circumstances, and Dr. Goebbels also showed an amazing composure. It seemed astonishing to me that they could come around and calmly say goodbye to everyone, knowing what they had just done and what was to come next. They were in control of their emotions, however, and their voices sounded firm. With solemn expressions, they wished everyone luck for the future. They shook hands with everyone, and then without apparent emotion they turned around and walked back through the hallway toward the Reich Propaganda Ministry to take their own lives there. Although Weidling had made arrangements to break out with Brigade Monke, he wanted to go back again to Bendlerstrasse to address the staff and give everybody the choice of breaking out or surrendering. It was still daylight. The Russians had already taken the Reichstag and were throwing everything they had against the Reich Chancellery. The Tiergarten was now the centre of the battle, and we were subjected to targeted artillery fire, machine gun fire, and small arms fire. I did not wait for Weidling, because 2 men would just present a bigger target than 1. We had no protection, and it would have been pointless to fire back with our puny little pistols. The best thing to do was to concentrate on being a small, quick target and reaching the next cover alive. I jumped from cover to cover swiftly. Weidling, who was twice my age, could not move as quickly. This extremely dangerous and physically exhausting trip, together with the events of the past 24 hours, must have finished off Weidling's nerves. He might alst have been influenced by von Duving's report about being treated correctly by the Russians. In any case, in the bunker at Bendlerstrasse, Weidling declared that he did not want to break out, but to surrender to the Russians instead. I told him I would like to take my leave, since I did not want to surrender, but, according to the arrangements we had made earlier, would rather take part in the breakout with Brigade Monke. Weidling turned on me in a terrible outburst of fury. This was the only time he ever became angry at me, apparently because he felt that I had deserted him on the return from Führer headquarters, although he did not say that directly. But he certainly had no right to accuse a soldier who had survived as much combat and been wounded as many times as I had of cowardice, and I told him so in rather explicit terms. We were probably both on the verge of nervous collapse. The human system can only take so much, and certainly we had put our systems to the test. Perhaps he took my desire to break out as a reproach, since he had told Monke an hour earlier that he would join him with his entire staff. Of course, we would have suffered losses getting to the Reich Chancellery, but most of us would have made it. In any case, he forbade me to leave the bunker before 10 p.m. Until then, according to him, he still needed me. But of course it would be too late for me to join the Monke group then. So with his order, Weidling sealed my fate and prevented me from trying to escape Russian captivity. I was still soldier enough to follow orders instead of deserting to try to break out on my own, although anger raged inside me. There was still work to do: preparation for the surrender, burning of all our papers and files, the official diary of the 56th Panzer Corps and Major Wolf's personnel files, orders to surrender to all units that could still be reached. After von Dufing gave a brief speech about his decent treatment by the Russians the night before, almost all the members of the staff were in agreement to surrender without further fighting and to become prisoners of war of the Russians. The exact orders for the surrender and the march into captivity would be rendered after von Dufing negotiated again directly with the Russians. It did not take long to establish radio contact. At midnight, von Dufing would be picked up as intermediary at the Bendler Bridge. He was to ask for the honourable surrender of our troops, an immediate ceasefire, the protection of civilians against terrorism, each soldier's right to keep food and personal belongings, and the right of officers and men to remain with their units. In the courtyard, fires were burning with all papers and the files of the Supreme Command of the Army. I was especially sorry that all the personnel files went up in flames, because I had always taken great pride in my military record. But the years of being a professional soldier were now over. When von Dufing returned from talking to the Russians, Weidling called all the staff together and told them that arrangements had been made for us to surrender the next morning. I wrote a letter to Lilo and addressed copies of it to various relatives, since I could not know who might still be alive. I gave the letters to several women, signal auxiliaries and Red Cross nurses, for whom the Russians had promised unimpeded travel. Then, for the last time, I ate a meal prepared by my orderly: tender green beans, boiled ham and fried potatoes. I also had 2 glasses of champagne. To be on the safe side, my orderly filled my haversack with food and my canteen with cognac. I then carefully took inventory of my personal things in order to decide what I might need most as a prisoner of war. The biggest question was whether to take my sleeping bag or my fur-lined overcoat. With my previous experiences with the cold winters in Russia firmly in my memory, the fur coat prevailed, even though summer had hardly begun. I exchanged my tailored uniform for a regulation uniform because it would not call attention to me and would be more comfortable. I pulled a pair of tanker's coveralls over that to cover the red General Staff stripes on my pants in case they should prove to be a liability. My best shirts and underwear, some food, my photographs and letters, and a few packs of cigarettes for barter completed my luggage. In spite of my throwing away a great many things, my knapsack must still have weighed over 30 pounds. And on top of that, my heavy fur-lined uniform overcoat. But if necessary, I could always throw some things away later. Of course, there was no thought of any sleep now. I had slept during artillery bombardments, and I had slept knowing that attack was imminent, but now the uncertainty of what lay ahead drove sleep away. I wandered outside, into the Berlin night. The mild spring night contrasted with the flaming ruins around us. An almost ghostly silence lay about us. It seemed almost tangible after the constant noise of battle during the past few weeks. As I surveyed the ruins around me, the question, "At what cost?" ran through my mind. The cost of this war had been far beyond the capacity of mere humans to tabulate. Did I feel in any way responsible for it on this night? Did I feel any moral guilt? Not yet, although it was to come later, when I learned much that I did not know on this night. For now, I regretted only that we had lost the war, and my first priority was surviving what lay immediately ahead of me. 1,000 questions about my destiny went through my head in the early darkness of that Berlin night. What would my new life as a prisoner of war of the Russian army be like if I were not shot? How long would captivity last? How would it end? I knew that when we had recaptured German towns from the Russians, we often learned that they had murdered the German officers they had captured. I felt that I had to assume that my life was now over and I would be shot. The biggest question was how things were at home. Had everyone survived the fighting in Leipzig? This question provoked another, more and more urgent. Should I try to avoid captivity? Should I now clamber on my own through the ruins and try to get home? I thought of the possibility of hiding in the rubble, taking enough to eat and drink to last several days until things quieted down, and then trying to escape to Leipzig. But I knew the Russians would be looking for people doing that. I was familiar with the ring of Russian forces around Berlin, and as the operations officer during the defence of Berlin, I knew the bottlenecks that had been created by the blown-up bridges everywhere. I knew, without any doubt, that there was no chance of my leaving Berlin without being caught. I drew my pistol from its holster, disassembled it, and threw the pieces as far as I could in different directions. I did not want it to become a souvenir for some Russian soldier. This symbolic act was my final resignation and surrender. I stood in the darkness and listened in amazement to the warbling of some thrushes nearby. I had not heard such sounds for so long, and it seemed incredible that they could have survived the final battle. It was spring, and the thrushes would be preparing to raise a new generation of themselves. Could there possibly be rebirth after such total destruction? In my present state of mind, I could not believe it. In any case, my world had ended. Soon dawn came, and we had to swallow the bitter pill of surrender to the Russians. At 5:55 a.m. on May 2nd, 1945, our arms were stacked and everyone was in marching formation in a grey Berlin drizzle. We were Weidling's core staff and a number of communications people, radio and telephone technicians, who had remained at Bendlerstrasse when the headquarters of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces moved out of Berlin. Devastation lay all about us. Much of the city was still burning in the drizzling rain, and the acrid smoke sharply assaulted our nostrils and eyes. Weidling had already gone by car to the Russian General Chwikov's headquarters near Tempelhof Airport. I busied myself getting the troops into formation and making sure that none had weapons. Oberst von Dufing, Oberst Refior, Major Wolf and I led the column to the end of Bendlerstrasse, about a half-block away, where the Russians were waiting for us on the far side of the Landwehr Canal. The canal was about 100 feet wide, with steep cement banks on each side. It had been used to move barges through the city. The bridge across the canal had been destroyed, but a huge bundle of cable that had been strung across the canal underneath the bridge was still intact. There were telephone and electric cables, thick cables, thin cables, cables of all different colours that went into the ground on each side of the canal. General Vasily Chwikov. Approximately 3 feet in diameter, the bundle of cables, all tied together, formed a workable footbridge, and the ranking Russian officer crossed it to our side. Von Dufing saluted and reported to him. The Russian officer spoke to von Dufing and then returned to the other side of the canal. About 24 Russian soldiers with submachine guns waited on the other side of the canal, along with several American-made jeeps. Our column crossed the bundle of cables, walking upright in single file. When I stepped onto the other side of the canal, I thought of it as the symbolic end of my life. The Russian soldiers with submachine guns all had big grins on their faces when we reached the other side. One of them said, "Hitler kaput," and they all giggled gleefully. They were enjoying their victory hugely, as any victorious soldiers would. Von Dufing talked to the Russian officer briefly, and then told Refior, Wolf and me that we were to be taken to General Chwikov's headquarters about 3 kilometres away. First, however, we drove only a few blocks to a Russian division headquarters, where we were put on display and looked over with a great deal of curiosity by the division staff. General Chwikov's headquarters was in a side street near Tempelhof Airport, in an upper-middle-class neighbourhood. Chwikov's headquarters was on the first floor of a large apartment building that had been built around the turn of the century. Some younger Russian officers led us through a corridor to a large room where General Weidling was awaiting us, and von Dufing reported the orderly surrender at the bridge. Finally, Chwikov's chief of staff came in, and a few minutes later Chwikov entered the room. We saluted, and he returned our salute. Chwikov instructed General Weidling to compose a written order instructing those German soldiers in the city who were still resisting to stop fighting. A German typewriter was brought in, and I typed Weidling's order as he dictated it. The Russian writer Ilya Ehrenberg incorrectly reported in an article I read later that a blonde female secretary typed the order, "I was blonde but male and a major in the general staff." I made several carbon copies at the directions of the Russians, and Weidling signed them all. The Russians kept one copy and gave the rest to Wolf and me. Weidling, von Dufing and Refior were then invited to join the Russians in a big breakfast feast at Chwikov's headquarters, while Major Wolf and I delivered General Weidling's order to the still resisting German troops. The feast was apparently a victory celebration. I am sure Weidling, von Dufing and Refior had no stomach for it, but they were hardly in a position to refuse the invitation. I went in one of the American-made jeeps with a Russian captain to a Russian Corps headquarters and then to a division headquarters. At both places I was gazed at with great curiosity. German-speaking Russian officers at their Corps headquarters asked about Hitler and Goering. I told them that Hitler was dead, and I did not know where Goering was. I had the impression that they were having a difficult time realizing that they had actually defeated Germany and that Berlin lay at their feet. One Russian officer at their division headquarters said to me in German, "What have you got to say about Auschwitz?" When I asked him what he meant, he said angrily, "What about Bergen-Belsen? What about Treblinka? What about Buchenwald?" He was turning red in the face with anger. I did not recognize the names, and I could not understand why he was getting so angry. He finally shouted, "Don't pretend you don't understand," and stormed from the room. The Russian captain and I then went to a Russian battalion headquarters at the Anhalter railroad station, where resistance was still taking place. I was taken to a group of German prisoners and instructed to select 2 soldiers from among them to deliver Weidling's order. I was told to assure them that the men delivering the order would be given written orders that would allow them to go home. I was later to learn not to believe such promises, but now I had no reason to doubt their sincerity. With such an incentive, there was no shortage of volunteers, and I selected 2 Feldwebels. I gave them a copy of Weidling's order and a white flag to carry. They were to take it to the German commander at the Europa House, a huge office building nearby. I watched them disappear down the railroad tracks at Anhalter station in the direction of the fighting. Then the Russian captain and I went to a different battalion, where we repeated the procedure, and then to a third. I am certain today that the Russians never honoured their promises to any of those men, because I learned quickly that they would promise anything they thought would get you to do what they wanted, and then just ignore the promise once you had done it. And it was a dangerous mission, because the resisting Germans were probably SS troops who were determined to fight to the last man and who would shoot anyone who tried to interfere. The Russian captain then returned me to Chwikov's headquarters. On the way, we passed through an area where there had been very heavy fighting the day before. The streets were filled with burned-out tanks, dead horses, and dead people. German and Russian corpses lay side by side. I especially remember 2 dead Russian soldiers on a balcony who stared down at us through lifeless eyes, streaks of their blood colouring the wall beneath the balcony. I had a terribly uneasy and queasy feeling, because I was in the jeep with the Russian captain, at the mercy of the Russians, and to some degree I was responsible for what had happened to these dead Russian soldiers. Although I had not actually been out in the street fighting with the men, we staff officers were the ones in charge of the fighting and of oiling the fighting machine to keep it working. It was a most unsettling feeling for me, but the Russian appeared to pay no particular attention to it. In general, the Russian officers were behaving correctly. Of course, they saw how Chwikov and his chief of staff treated us, and they conducted themselves accordingly. When we arrived back at Chwikov's headquarters, Weidling was no longer there, but Refior and von Duving were. I was taken into the banquet room, where a huge table was loaded down with gourmet food, and was invited to help myself. There was champagne, caviar tarts, every conceivable kind of meat and cheese, and endless other kinds of food. Major Wolf had already returned and was there also, and we took advantage of the food because we could not know when we would have another meal. Then we were instructed to retrieve our knapsacks of belongings and were put in a jeep and taken to a column of marching German prisoners. We were told to join the column. Wolf and I marched in the column of German soldiers the rest of that day. I had one scary moment when a Russian guard pulled me out of the column in a wooded area and motioned for me to give him my boots. Believing I would not be able to survive without them, I gambled and started shouting at him, dressing him down as I would a German soldier who had just misbehaved. It worked. He instinctively snapped to attention, just as if I had been a Russian officer, and I quickly slipped back into the column before he could regain his composure. It was a terrible gamble, and possibly a stupid one as well, because he could have shot me and taken my boots, and no one would have cared. But it had worked, and that was for the moment all that mattered. That night we arrived at a big improvised prison camp behind a barbed wire fence. It had been a cement factory and a large gravel pit. It was in a suburb of Berlin, in the general vicinity of Rüdersdorf. More than 1,000 of us were lodged in the camp. The camp had several large buildings, and we could have got inside if it had rained. Wolf and I found a corner and just waited to see what would happen next. We had both brought food, so we had something to eat. The Russians provided no food the first few days. The compound in which we were held was huge. All we were provided at first was water and toilet facilities. It wasn't exactly sanitary, but the Russians did their best because they were very much afraid of epidemics. Although we had no bathing facilities or soap, we had unlimited access to running water, and a fire was kept going at a central location so we could heat water. Wolf and I inspected the entire prison compound. Then there was nothing to do. After the incredible pace of our lives during the past several months, such enforced idleness was almost nerve-wracking. I had to keep fighting the urge to jump up and get busy. It was almost impossible to accept that there was nothing to do. I tried to suppress any thoughts about the implications of our having lost the war, about my immediate future, about what I was sure was to come. Wolf and I got to know each other better on a personal level. He was in his late 20s, just under 6 feet, with thin brown hair, blue eyes, and a perpetual smile. Wolf had also brought some coffee and a box of good cigars, so in the afternoons at 4 o'clock we would get some hot water and have a cup of coffee and smoke a cigar. It seemed so good that we decided we would do the same every afternoon as long as we were together there. We did not know what would happen, how long we would be there, or even how long we would live, so every afternoon at 4 we got some hot water and had coffee and a Dutch Rittmeister cigar. That became our daily quiet hour, when we would talk about family, about home, about the future, what was likely to happen, whether we would ever go home again. I really did not smoke, but during those first days in prison, in this special hour, with all the reminiscing and talking about home and the future, this became something special. Otherwise, our life in this camp was very monotonous and boring. We spent our time talking with other prisoners, being counted and so forth. We slept on the ground, but we could get inside if the weather turned bad. Having been relieved of the responsibility for making decisions constantly, I was suddenly overpowered by a craving for sleep and could not seem to get enough. One day after we had been there about 2 weeks, my name was called out on the loudspeaker. "Major Knapper, report to the gate." I thought, well, this is it. Now I will be shot. I really felt nothing special at the prospect of dying. So many people had died, and I would be just one more. I shook Wolf's hand and took my leave of him. He had my address in case he got home. I got my bag and went to the gate. The camp commander and a Russian major were waiting for me with a jeep. The camp commander just said, "Go with the major." We got into the jeep and drove to Köpenick. In addition to the major and me, there was a driver and a guard with a submachine gun. They stopped the jeep in front of a 5-story apartment building. I was taken to the 3rd or 4th floor, which proved to be something of a gentleman's prison for German officers. I did not know any of them, but there were perhaps a dozen. Some were generals, some were general staff officers, and some were communications officers. Here we were treated quite well. There were beds, and there were kitchens in the different apartments, and we got food to cook. This was much better than the gravel pit camp with 1,000 or so prisoners, with its dust and dirt and crowded conditions and little chance to wash. We all had difficulty adapting to our enforced idleness after so many months of frenzied activity. We exchanged our stories of those last months, but there was little else to do except prepare our meals and get to know each other. Once each day we were allowed to walk around the backyard for perhaps an hour, with several armed guards watching us. I had taken off my army trousers and wore my riding breeches with red general staff stripes. The Russian guards at the rear door always saluted me when I went out of and into the building, apparently mistaking me for a general because of the red stripes on my breeches. They must have been surprised by how young some of the German generals were. One of the people here was an old general of perhaps 70, who had retired many years before. He lived in Berlin, and someone in his neighbourhood had told the Russians that he was a general, so they had made him put on his uniform and brought him here. It was fortunate for him, at his age, that they brought him here to this more comfortable place. But they seemed to treat generals differently anyway. From our windows in this apartment building we could see the street in front. The back of the building overlooked the Spree River, but between the river and the apartment building were gardens. The distance between the building and the river was a few hundred metres. The river at that location was perhaps 200 metres wide. I decided to try to escape and swim across the river. I had no idea what would await me on the other side, but there was at least the possibility that there were no Russians. From there I thought I might be able to hide during the day and move short distances at night. It was about 200 kilometres from there to Leipzig. There were gardens on the other side of the river, and each garden had a little tool shed, and I thought I would be able to hide in one of the sheds the first day. I hoped I would be able to get civilian clothes from the people who lived there. Our apartment building happened to be the last in a row of apartment buildings, and the next building would have been built against the wall of this one. We had freedom of movement in the building, so I started exploring to see what I could learn that might help me escape. In the attic I found a heavy clothesline that was long enough to reach the ground, and I discovered that from the attic I could remove some tiles from the roof so I could anchor the rope in the attic and put the line down the blank wall at the end of the building. I started watching the guards to see if I could establish a pattern. They kept one guard in front of the building and one in back. I noticed that at times the two guards arrived at the end of the house at the same time, leaving the other end unguarded. I noticed also that they changed guards in front and back at the same time, and that when they did, the guards usually stayed there and talked for a few minutes. The guards patrolled the front and back of the house, but not the end. I watched them carefully and timed them. I decided that if I timed it right, I would be able to get down the rope, hide in the tall weeds at the end of the building until the guards were both at the far end, or until they changed again, and then get to the river, swim across, and hide there in a garden tool shed. It would have to be at night, and it would have to be a moonless night. Unfortunately, the moon was bright during this period. I could only wait for a dark night. Everything else was ready. Finally, the time arrived when I felt the next night would be dark enough. That morning, as we were having breakfast, the Russian officer in charge of the building came in with a happy smile on his face. When he saw me, his face brightened even more. "Major Knapper, you are a lucky man," he said. "You are going to Moscow." For a Russian, to go to Moscow was a wonderful thing. For me, however, it was not so wonderful. Instead of swimming across the Spree River to possible freedom that night, I would be landing in Moscow. He told me to be ready to leave at 10 o'clock. I hurriedly wrote a letter to Lilo and gave it to the old general, who was going home and offered to take a letter for me. At Tempelhof Airport, I was put aboard an American DC-3 cargo plane that was full of German loot the Russians were taking to Moscow. The passengers, a dozen or so Russian officers and soldiers in addition to me, sat on rolls of expensive carpet. I had to wonder if it could be the same carpet General Weidling and I had climbed over in the basement of Führer headquarters. The Russian soldiers stared at me when they boarded, the airplane, but ignored me thereafter. The airplane lifted off the ground in the bright June sunshine and turned eastward toward the vast Soviet Union. My heart was heavy with the realization that my last chance for an easy escape had passed, and it seemed that the higher the airplane climbed, the more my hope for freedom diminished. My next stop was Moscow, and an unknown fate. We flew over the same ground I had covered when we invaded Russia in June 1941, 4 years earlier to the month, as a young artillery battery commander and Oberleutnant. In 1941, we had taken 6 months to cover the same area on horseback and on foot, an area we would now cover by airplane in a few hours. We had been fighting as we crossed the same territory then, of course, but the fighting had not become severe until we passed Smolensk on the way to Moscow. I could not help wondering whether I would ever make the return trip, even though I felt certain I would be shot when the Russians had everything they wanted from me. Yet it had all begun with such promise. My mind drifted back to 1936, the year I graduated from Petrie Gymnasium, to a ski trip in the Sudeten Mountains that 4 friends and I had taken to celebrate our graduation. The road was getting steeper and more curving, with the view around each bend becoming more spectacular than the last. The 5 of us in the car, Werner Friedrich, Hans Liebelt, Siegfried Ebert, Ernst Michaelis and I, had graduated from gymnasium together just a week before, on March 6, 1936. We had all entered gymnasium together 9 years ago, at the age of 10, and 2 years ago we began planning this ski trip to celebrate our graduation. Friedrich was exuberant, as usual, challenging everyone to a race once we reached the ski area and assuring us all that we did not stand a chance. We were all anticipating the trip with great excitement. Finally, we rounded the last steep, sharp curve, and there, slightly below us, nestled securely in the lap of the Sudeten Mountains of Silesia, was our ski village. We found a place to leave our car, a sedan that belonged to Liebelt's father, and followed signs to the cabin check-in office in a running snowball fight. Our faces must have looked quite flushed, from both the cold air and the running, to the old man we startled when we charged through the door. "Hello there," he said. "What can I do for you?" He peered at us over oval wire-framed glasses. "We have a reservation for one of your cabins," Ebert said. "The name is Siegfried Ebert." "Let's see." He flipped through what looked like scrap papers. "Here it is," he said. "I am Hofer." He extended his hand, and in turn we each shook it. His grip was firm in spite of his advanced age and his frail build. We each put our share of the money on the counter. He slowly counted the money and carefully placed it in an old wooden lockbox, then sorted through a pile of keys until he found the one he wanted. "Here you are," he said. He smiled, his old eyes twinkling behind his glasses as he dangled the key before Ebert. "Have a good time, boys." Ebert took the key, and we herded each other out of the office, eager to begin our adventure. We began to unload our gear from the car, which amounted to throwing everything into a pile. "Here, carry this," came an order, followed by something thudding into my back. I knew it was Friedrich without turning around. As usual, he was taking charge and dividing up the gear to be carried to the cabin. When we were all finally loaded to Friedrich's satisfaction, we trudged up the mountain toward our cabin. Although the temperature was only 28 degrees Fahrenheit, the steep climb up the mountain made us sweat. The cabin was one big rectangular room with 2 windows, one facing east or front, and the other facing the slopes to the west. On the north wall was a huge fireplace, complete with a spit for roasting meat, a bar for hanging kettles, and a small iron grid for skillets, pots, pans, and other utensils hanging from the mantel. On the south wall were 2 sets of bunks. We had been instructed to bring sleeping bags and pillows. "Let's ski!" yelled Friedrich. In a rush, we got our skis out of the pile of gear. We had to go only a few paces until we were at a slope. Down we would go, then back up we would struggle, only to be unable to resist going down one more time. We went down one more time until we could barely crawl. Finally, we'd had enough and made our way back to the cabin. We decided to eat in the village because we were too tired to cook. The aroma inside the cafe immediately provoked hunger rumblings in our very empty bellies. There were no customers, and there appeared to be no employees either. We were all fidgety from hunger. Friedrich and I leaned our chairs back on two legs. "Take it easy on the furniture," a familiar voice boomed as Herr Hofer popped into the room as if from nowhere. Our chairs dropped to all fours promptly. "Hello, boys. Can't stand your own cooking, huh? No matter, Frau Hofer will feed you." A second later, she came bustling into the room and told us what we would be eating. Knowing that our supper was on the way, we settled down. I looked through the window. From our table, we could barely see the foot of the mountain, which was muted by the soft glow of the few streetlights. A gentle, lazy snowfall had begun, with large, aimless flakes wafting slowly to earth. In the warm cafe, with the aroma of food being prepared, we enjoyed a satisfied sense of being free and yet cared for. Outside, a farm boy about our age led a draft horse that was pulling a sled loaded high with hay slowly along the road. Old Herr Hofer and another man about his age had begun a game of chess at a table near us, carrying on a constant conversation about politics as they played. Frau Hofer emerged from the kitchen, pushing a cart laden with food. She deftly placed the bowls of food in front of us and handed us each an empty plate and the necessary silverware. Without further conversation, we ate every morsel she had placed in front of us. We all seemed to lean back and heave a satisfied sigh at nearly the same time. Frau Hofer must have been watching us from the kitchen because here she came again, with the empty cart. She quickly cleared the table and left us to ourselves for our own after-dinner discussion. Suddenly, we were aware of Herr Hofer's voice becoming louder. "Hitler is going to get us into another war," he said emphatically. "Why do you say that?" his chess partner demanded. "Because Hitler is a gambler, and gamblers will not quit until they lose." "I do not know how you can say that," his chess partner responded. "He has provided people with jobs, he has restored the economy, he has stopped all the political brawling in the streets, he has built the autobahns, he has torn up the Versailles Treaty and restored national pride, he has even reclaimed the Rhineland." The old man finally ran out of breath. "And how has he done all those things?" Herr Hofer demanded. "He has provided jobs by building up the armaments industry. What do you think he is planning to do with all that firepower? Admire it. And he restored peace to the streets by putting all his political opponents and a lot of Jews as well into concentration camps." We all glanced furtively at Michaelis, who was Jewish. "So, why do you say that Hitler is a gambler?" the other old man asked. "What do you think would have happened if the French had resisted when our troops marched into the Rhineland?" Herr Hofer asked. "Our pitiful force would have been wiped out. But Hitler was playing poker, and he gambled that his opponent would not call his bluff. He won that hand, and he may win more, but eventually he is going to overstep himself, because gamblers never quit when they are winning. They always keep betting until they lose." "But he is just getting back what the Versailles Treaty took away from us," his friend protested. Herr Hofer rose and walked to the fireplace, where he knocked the ashes out of his pipe. "He won't stop there," he said. "He will continue until he gets us into another war. And at what cost?" He turned and waved his hand in our direction. "At the cost of these boys' lives, most likely, as well as the lives of millions of others." "What an old grouch!" Friedrich whispered to the rest of us. "I am not so sure he is not right," Michaelis offered in a quiet voice. No one responded. Michaelis's being Jewish made us all uneasy in the context of the old men's conversation. We returned to our cabin, where we got a new fire going quickly because it was cold. Up at daybreak the next morning, we made tea, had breakfast, and were hiking up the mountain with our skis on our shoulders in less than an hour. As we crested the mountain, the view into Czechoslovakia was as breathtaking as the view on the German side. We skied all day, speeding down the glittering pristine slope and then trudging back up with our skis on our shoulders. Then we skied the cross-country route we had laid out the evening before. In late afternoon, we finally decided to call it a day and skied down the German side of the mountain to our cabin. After getting a fire going, we poured some beans into a kettle, covered them with water, and hung them over the fire. Then we peeled potatoes and did the same with them. Soon both were boiling busily, and we waited patiently for them to cook. Half an hour later, the potatoes were soft to the touch of a fork and obviously ready, but the beans appeared to be as hard as ever. "What kind of beans did you buy, Knapper?" Friedrich demanded. "Just beans. Why? Are there different kinds?" I asked sheepishly. "I don't know, but are you sure these were meant to be cooked? They have been on that fire an hour and a half." "Let's eat the potatoes," Abert suggested. "We will eat the beans whenever they are ready." We divided the potatoes into 5 equal portions and devoured them with bread and butter and a fresh pot of tea. We felt better after eating, although the potatoes alone did not completely satisfy our appetites. Together, we slowly cleaned up the mess, checked the fire, and put fresh water over the still boiling beans. "Want some American popcorn?" Liebert asked, rising to go get it from his gear. "What is that?" I asked. "I will show you," Liebert said, returning with a bag of tiny kernels of corn and a skillet. "My uncle in America sent this to us from Chicago. You heat the kernels in a skillet and they pop open. They're good. Move those stupid beans off the fire. They're never going to be edible anyway." He put some butter into the skillet, melted it, and then filled the skillet half full of yellow kernels. Liebert rearranged the logs and laid the iron grills squarely on top of them, then carefully set the heavy skillet on popping, slowly down on the grill. The popcorn was so in the beginning, and then with increasing rapidity. "Grab a lid!" Liebert shouted as popcorn shot out of the skillet and into the flames. I grabbed one, but it was too late. Things were out of control. The corn was popping so fast that it had risen well above the level of the skillet and was spilling into the fire. Liebert had evidently put too much popcorn into the skillet. As the popped kernels fell into the fire, they began to smoke and fill the cabin with a burnt odour. "Open the door," someone said. Liebert pulled the skillet off the grill, but the heated cast iron retained its heat, and the corn continued popping and spilling onto the floor. Nonetheless, some was edible, so we set the skillet in front of us and began to dig handfuls from it. "You're right, it really is good," Friedrich agreed. A knock sounded at the door. It was Herr Hofer. "Frau Hofer thought you might like these cookies," he said. When he saw the kettle of beans, a smile crossed his old face. "I see you tried to cook beans without soaking them," he said. We stared at him. "Soaking them?" I asked lamely. "You must soak beans overnight before cooking them," he said. "It is a common mistake." We looked at one another and groaned inwardly. The next morning we were up and on the German side of the mountain slope early. The day was one long competition. We staged downhill speed races, jumping competitions, competition to see who could get back up the hill fastest, and by the time the sun disappeared we were exhausted but exhilarated. We fixed ourselves a supper of cold cuts and tea and relaxed in front of the comfortable fire in the fireplace. "Do you realize that tomorrow is our last day already?" Ebert said a bit sadly. We all stared silently into the fire a moment. One more day, and then we would have to take up our new adult lives. I would be leaving for Reichsarbeitsdienst, Reich Labour Service. Friedrich would be entering the army. By agreeing to become an officer candidate after his first year in the army, he had avoided labour service. Michaelis would be entering university. He did not have to serve in the labour service or army because he was Jewish, and Ebert and Liebert would be entering a university to study medicine, which also exempted them from labour service. Suddenly, what the transition from child to adult meant was becoming real. We would be splitting up. There were no competitions the last day. We each went our own leisurely way. I skied long, slow, curving swoops, trying to savour these last moments. At one point I stopped skiing to listen to some thrushes singing in the nearby pines as they busily went about building their nests. Germany was truly a beautiful place. With all this splendour, how could Herr Hofer possibly be right? How could anything go wrong? I took a deep breath and propelled myself on down the slope. In the morning of Sunday, April 4th, 1936, I woke early and with great anticipation. I was to be at Augustus Square at 9 o'clock to be transported by bus to somewhere in Bavaria, where I would serve the next 6 months in Reich Labour Service. I breakfasted with my family. My 14-year-old brother, Fritz, was excited about my impending adventure and seemed to look forward to it for me. My older sister, Ingeborg, tall, thin, blonde and sober, was convinced that I was making a big mistake by not going directly to the university instead of getting labour service and the army out of the way first, and she said so. My mother hovered maternally around me, alternately bubbly and teary-eyed. As we ate breakfast, she scolded Inge for her remark that I was making a mistake. Inge pouted a bit and said nothing. We all seemed awkward when I arose from the table. "Well," my father said, not looking directly at me. "I guess it's time." "Yes," I replied, noticing his discomfort and loss for words. My throat went dry, and I swallowed in the hope of finding the appropriate action. Finding none, I merely extended my hand. He slowly raised his and gripped mine firmly, then held my hand in both of his. In the background, my mother sniffled. Then she wrapped her arms around me. Few words were spoken. Few needed to be. I looked around for Inge, but she was no longer in the room. Fritz punched me on the shoulder. I picked up my suitcase and headed out the door. Once out in the street, I walked quickly away, my family calling goodbye. At Augustus Square, I looked around at the milling crowd of young men my own age, hoping to see a familiar face, but I saw none. I did notice a figure in a Labour Service uniform standing near 3 parked buses. Shortly before 9 o'clock, he bellowed in a voice of unbelievable volume. "All right, we are going to fill these 3 buses front to back. I want every seat in the first bus full before a man sets foot in the second. When I call out your name, get in the bus on the double." As we left Leipzig, the bus moved through the streets that I had known all my life. I felt as if we were rolling out of my childhood and into a new adult world. I had been away from home on vacations before, but never for as long as 6 months. I was looking forward to this new adult experience. By the time we arrived at our destination at 7 o'clock, it was almost dark. We were at the village of Burglengenfeld, near the Czechoslovakian border. The Labour Service camp consisted of several buildings. The main building was a large former villa that had been remodelled to house as many as 160 people. The buses pulled up in front of this main building and disembarked their passengers. The Labour Service man ordered us all to gather around a porch in front of the building. The buses pulled away then, making me feel very much alone in the midst of 160 boys. As we grew quiet, the Labour Service man announced in that awe-inspiring voice he had used in the square, "Gentlemen, the commanding officer of Burglengenfeld Labour Service Camp, Abteilungsführer Werner." He drew himself stiffly to attention as a middle-aged man in a fancier Labour Service uniform emerged through the door behind him. The commanding officer appeared very straight and military as he looked out over us in his neatly tailored uniform, seeming somehow to look each of us in the eye. "Welcome to Burglengenfeld, men," he said, in a voice nearly as impressive as his subordinates. "Now you are proud Labour Service men." He continued his brief prepared speech, informing us that our first 4 weeks would be training in military drill, and only then would we be permitted to go to work for the fatherland. He finished by saying, "I leave you now in the capable hands of your leader, Gruppenführer Brandt." Then he turned and disappeared into the building from which he had emerged. After being assigned room numbers, we piled into the building. I was assigned to room 7, which had 4 bunks, 4 lockers, and 1 big table with 4 chairs. The other 3 occupants of room 7 were a fat boy named Dietl, a gangly farm boy named Fisher, and a little red-haired guy named Zimmerman. The next morning we were rudely awakened at 5:30 by the voice, bellowing with an unbelievable volume, "On your feet!" He was standing in front of his room, which was next door to ours, projecting a volume intended to wake the whole building. We were jolted out of a deep sleep and looked at one another in wonderment. Brant appeared in our doorway. Although short and stocky, he appeared much larger in the doorway. "One person from each room go to the mess hall and get breakfast for your room," he ordered. At promptly 6:30, the voice ordered us out into the square in front of the building. We were divided into 4 squads and introduced to our squad leaders. Mine was squad leader Krupp, who was about 21 years old, tall, broad-chested, with sandy blonde hair and a pleasant expression. Each of the 4 squad leaders selected a different spot on the soccer field, far enough apart that each could issue orders to his squad without causing confusion among the other squads. Krupp, who seemed at ease and calm about his duties and us, was a pleasant contrast to the constantly bellowing Brant. He patiently taught us first how to stand at attention, then how to space ourselves apart with an eyes right manoeuvre. That was followed by how to step off on our left heels at the command of forward march, then how to react to a squad halt command. We finished by learning how to do left face, right face, and about face, a Reich Labour Service squad marching. Finally, we were marched to the supply building and issued uniforms. We were issued different uniforms for work, for parade, for exercising, and for sports. Then we were marched by squads to the mess hall for lunch. A half-hour of free time followed, during which we admired ourselves and one another in our new uniforms. The little guy, Zimmerman, kept jerking himself to attention and saluting everybody, making a joke of it. His sense of humour helped relax everyone. In the afternoon, we attended an hour-long class, mostly on the new Greater German Reich. Herr Hoffer's warning crept into my thoughts during the lecture, but I forced it aside. We were learning discipline, order, and how to follow commands. These were all positive qualities, and I felt good about it. Following the training session, we were marched back to the supply building, where we were each issued a shiny new spade. Krupp marched us back to the soccer field. I felt as if I were playing soldier, now that I had something on my shoulder as we marched. Krupp called us to attention to begin our spade instructions. "Men," he began, "this is the labour service, and this spade is the symbol of work and toil. The spade you now hold will never touch dirt. It will be used strictly for exercise and parades. At all times your spade must sparkle as if it were made of chrome. Since they are steel and not chrome, they will rust easily. Spot inspections are to be expected." Krupp then offered instructions on how to keep the spades clean by rubbing them with wet sand that was kept in a big bin in the courtyard, and he advised us to work on the spade every day rather than waiting until rust built up on it. After another hour of drill in which we were taught to march properly with the spades on our shoulders, we were finally released to return to our rooms. We had an hour to get cleaned up for supper and get to know each other. In the mess hall at supper, we were instructed to meet at 7:30 in the assembly hall. That meeting was to give us the next day's schedule and any announcements that needed to be made. Following the announcements, one of the squad leaders led us in some organised singing. Then we had an hour to relax before the lights were turned out at 10 o'clock. We spent the following 4 weeks learning military drill and routine. An important function of labour service was to free the army from having to do this very basic type of training. Everyone who went into labour service would also be drafted into the army, and we would enter the army already partially trained. We were not permitted out of the camp the first 4 weeks. We had a library, however, and a recreation hall with ping-pong tables, card tables, and chess sets. Our 4 weeks of training passed quickly with drill, calisthenics, and classes. We were acquiring a general familiarity with military life. At the end of the 4-week training period, we were inspected by the camp commander and then released to begin our work detail. On our first workday following our training period, we marched 40 minutes to a strip coal mine with parade spades on our shoulders. We fell out and stacked our parade spades like rifles in 4-spade pyramids. I worried about my spade because I kept it perfectly clean. I hated putting it in the stack with the others from my squad, for fear someone would grab mine and leave his rusted one for me to clean. We were then issued working spades. The work we did consisted of removing layers of dirt from veins of coal and loading the dirt onto lorries, small tip-bed freight cars, that were pulled by a narrow-gauge steam engine. Brandt did not accompany us on work detail, although we were warned that it was not unusual for him to pop in to check things out. We were given 45 minutes for lunch. Late in the afternoon, we would march back to camp, arriving by 5 o'clock. We would wash and have dinner, followed by assembly, which would feature either singing or a history lesson. At times, we also had to do kitchen duty or guard duty, just as in the army. One of our first days at work proved to be especially tiring because the weather was very hot and humid. The work spade had worn blisters on my hands, and sweat poured from my body, making it extremely desirable to gnats, flies, and mosquitoes. To make matters worse, Brandt rode up on a bicycle while we were eating lunch. He parked the bicycle and headed directly for the pyramid of parade spades. "You call these clean?" he bellowed, kicking the pyramids over, all the spades spattering in mud. I gulped, knowing that mine had been clean, and I had strategically placed it so I would know which one was mine. Now they all lay like identical matchsticks covered with mud. "Tonight we will polish spades from 10 o'clock until midnight, and we will do it every night until all these spades are clean," he said. A groan arose, because we were already exhausted and knew we had another half-day of work in this heat and humidity. At 10 o'clock, as promised, we were called together to clean spades. My muscles ached, my blistered hands hurt, and I had someone else's grimy spade. As I scrubbed and scraped with wet sand, Inga's face appeared before me, laughing in an "I told you so" manner. I blinked her away, only to have Friedrich's face appear with the same look. The only good thing about the endless 2 hours was that I never saw Brandt's face. In June, we received a 5-day furlough to go home. We travelled again by chartered bus from Burglengenfeld to Leipzig. We were unsupervised this time, except for the bus drivers, and we knew each other for the trip home. Our conduct was a good deal more boisterous during the all-day ride, but by the time we reached Leipzig we had tamed down considerably. As we entered the outskirts of Leipzig, we began to see the familiar Leipzig trolleys, with their distinctive green and beige colour designs that were unique to the city of Leipzig. I had not consciously felt homesick during my 3 months in labour service, but the sight of the first Leipzig trolley brought an unexpected lump to my throat, and I realised for the first time how much I had really missed my home. The buses took us to Augustus Square, and I caught a trolley to my parents' apartment, arriving in early evening. I cannot describe the feeling of warmth and security that came rushing back when I was in the midst of my family again. My mother's face beamed from ear to ear, and she fed me until I thought I would burst. Fritz asked questions so incessantly that I hardly had a chance to answer them, and my uniform so impressed him that he could hardly wait to enter labour service himself. Almost in spite of herself, even Inga was curious about my experience. Her presence reminded me of the muddy spade episode, which I did not mention. My father just smiled happily and was content to let everyone else have centre stage. After 3 days at home, we departed by chartered bus again from Augustus Square. The trip back to Burglengenfeld was not as lively or enthusiastic as the trip home had been. I did not know how a few days could make such a difference, but I felt that I was somehow older and more mature when we arrived back at camp that night. We quickly returned to our old routine of calisthenics and jogging after breakfast, marching 40 minutes to the strip mine, singing as we went, working all day, marching home, cleaning up, having supper, going to assembly, and going to bed. On weekends, we were free from 4 p.m. on Saturday until 10 p.m. on Sunday. 3 or 4 of us would go by train to a nearby city that seemed interesting to us. We would visit the cathedrals and museums and other noteworthy buildings. We would have lunch in a restaurant and go to a movie, or maybe to a dance and meet girls. Our parents supplemented our pay, so we could afford to do these things. For our labour, we were paid a half-mark a day, which was just enough for snacks and incidentals. We were paid each week. The final leg of labour service occurred with the selection of those of us who would parade at a huge political rally the government was planning to stage at Nuremberg on September 8, 1936. The Army, the SA, the SS, the Labour Service, and the Hitler Youth were all to parade in a grand spectacle. Tens of thousands would be participating in the parade. The purpose of the political rally, called the Reichsparteitag, was to unify the German people and to impress the rest of Europe with our military strength and martial spirit. Only those of us who demonstrated the greatest skill on the parade ground were selected. To my delight, I was among the 10% of my Abteilung to go, as was Fischer. Those selected to go to Nuremberg began to work less and do extra drill in preparation for the rally. We practiced drilling by ourselves for 2 weeks, and then we went to Amberg for 2 weeks of drilling in a company-sized unit composed of elements from several different labour service Abteilungen. We went to Nuremberg, which was not far away, by bus. We arrived the day before our parade and disembarked from the buses in the city. We marched the 2 miles from Nuremberg to a virtual tent city that had been erected for all of us who were taking part in the parades, through the traffic-cleared and flag-lined streets of the inner city. The sidewalks were packed with cheering people, and bands were placed at strategic locations, all playing martial music for us to march to. More than 1,500 tents, each accommodating 6 people, were arranged in neat rows, with grass streets running between the rows of tents. Many tens of thousands of people were participating in the parades, which were to continue for 5 days. We had already been assigned tent numbers and even bunks in the tents. We arrived in late afternoon, and by the time we got settled in our tents, evening was beginning to descend. We were marched to a huge tent mess hall and fed. Then we were marched back to our tents and dismissed. Fischer and I decided to walk around the tent city and see what was going on. It was almost a carnival atmosphere. Everyone was excited about being in Nuremberg on such an auspicious occasion. Everyone knew that Hitler, Göring, Goebbels, and all the other high party people would be in the reviewing stand watching us march. The excitement of possibly seeing them swelled in my chest. Lanterns appeared in the tents as darkness began to smother daylight. Card games sprang up in some of the tents. Here and there groups of young men would break lustily into marching songs. The smell of kerosene drifted through the air from kerosene fires that glowed atop 10-foot columns spaced approximately 50 feet apart in every direction throughout the camp. Everywhere young men milled about in the grass and dirt streets, talking, laughing, practicing drill steps. Everyone was giddy with excitement and anticipation. I had never seen so many people in one place. We went to sleep that night eagerly anticipating the great honour that tomorrow would bring. At 10 o'clock the next morning, we performed a carefully timed march into the stadium. We stood at parade rest and watched a precision presentation by sports units consisting of teenage boys and girls who performed intricate manoeuvres and then marched past the reviewing stand. Shortly before noon, the tension began to rise in us as our turn neared. We still stood at parade rest, facing the reviewing stand, with its enormous granite swastika below the German eagle. Achtung! Boomed over the loudspeakers, and we snapped to quivering attention. At one command, 10,000 spades went up, with the sun reflecting on them dramatically. The spades would turn with every revolution, the sun flashing on them. On command, we formed a series of large rectangles and then went through a series of manoeuvres with the spades, turning them, putting them up, putting them down, presenting spades, etc. We had to be careful not to bash the man in front of us with the spade. It was heavy, and a spade is more difficult to handle than a rifle. It must have been a tremendous spectacle, and from the reports we received, the Labour Service parade was the most impressive of the parades that year. Then we were ordered to parade rest, and after some martial music, someone made a speech. From my vantage point as one of 10,000 Labour servicemen, I could barely see the reviewing stand, but we all knew that Chancellor Hitler, General Feldmarschall Göring, and all the important government figures were there watching us. That knowledge induced a peculiar tingle of excitement in us. We felt 10 feet tall and indestructible. This was pageantry of the highest order, and it inspired enormous national pride in us. It was a jubilant extravaganza with the unmistakable message that Germany was being reborn. I felt extremely proud. Back at the camp, we could hardly sit still. We wanted the feverish emotions aroused by the thrilling experience on the parade ground to continue. We were not allowed to leave the camp, however, because our leaders did not want to turn 10,000 keyed-up young men loose on Nuremberg. We were marched back to our buses and put aboard them for the return trip. After the Nuremberg rally, we returned to Burglengenfeld to finish our nearly completed tour of duty with Labour service. The rest of it was anticlimactic after the glamour and excitement of Nuremberg. Finally, on September 24, 1936, we had a discharge ceremony, and Abteilungsführer Werner thanked us for our service. We gave back our uniforms, put on our old civilian clothes, received our final pay, and were released to go home. Although we had been brought to Burglengenfeld by chartered bus, we were trusted to return on the train by ourselves. 5 weeks later, on October 15, 1936, I boarded the train that would take me from Leipzig to Jena, some 40 miles away, to begin my new life as a soldier in the artillery. My father had been a naval gunnery officer before and during the World War, and all during my childhood he had told me many thrilling stories about the big guns. Whenever I had thought of myself as a soldier, I had always thought in terms of those glamorous big guns. For 2 years, our newspapers had been full of stories about the technological advances that had been achieved in mechanizing our modern army, including the artillery, and I had volunteered for the artillery with visions of driving self-propelled, mechanized artillery. As the train neared Jena, I saw a large complex of barracks. Turning to the middle-aged man sitting next to me, I asked if he knew what they were. He looked up from his newspaper to tell me they were infantry barracks. A little closer to town was another barracks complex. My seat companion, who was a bit portly and starting to grey at the temples, told me this was the artillery. Then, to my dismay, I saw horse stables and horses, and my heart began to sink. I turned to my seat companion in consternation. "You mean they still pull the artillery with horses?" I asked, hoping desperately that it was not true. "Yes, I am afraid so," he said softly, sensing my disappointment. Suddenly the artillery lost all its glamour and appeal. Instead of driving massive mechanized artillery, I would be driving horses. I wanted to turn around and go back home. At the army barracks, an Unteroffizier sat at a desk. He asked my name, found it on his list, put a check mark beside it, and said curtly, "Room 29. He was clearly bored with the routine. When I looked at him quizzically, he responded, "Second floor." The door to room 29 was open, and a soldier in uniform sat at a table inside. When I walked up to the doorway, he stood and extended his hand. "I am Oberkanonier Barricel," he said. "I'm going to be your room elder." I shook his hand and introduced myself. He had me select a bunk, and I unpacked my satchel and stored my belongings in a locker next to the bunk. The room had 6 bunks and lockers and a large table with 6 chairs. My other roommates began to trickle in. The first was Ernst Rauscher, who had been an assembly line worker in a factory. The next was named Peter Wolthat, a farm boy. Next came Boris Weinreich, a tall, strikingly handsome specimen who was from East Prussia, the son of a schoolmaster. Our final roommate was a city urchin named Vogel. I went to bed that night, still disappointed that the artillery was horse-drawn, but I finally drifted into a sound sleep. A whistle woke us rudely at 5 o'clock the next morning. "Out of bed!" Barricel shouted. "God, it's still the middle of the night," Vogel moaned. Well, a little stable duty before breakfast will bring morning around, Barisel grinned. You have exactly 1 minute to be assembled in front of the building if you do not want extra duty. We all jerked our heads toward him, startled, and I began frantically to pull on our clothing. Shivering in the early morning cold and darkness, we assembled in front of the building. Barcel led us to an area and arranged us in a formation with other men from other rooms. Barisel and the other uniformed room elders remained outside the formation. An Obergefreiter appeared, called us to attention, and marched us to the horse stables. I still could not believe I was actually in the horse-drawn artillery. It all seemed so backward in this modern age. 1 man per stall, the Obergefreiter instructed. We tentatively moved toward the stable. "Move it!" he shouted. We ran to our posts, selecting our stalls at random. When we had taken up our positions, he called us to attention. "I am Obergefreiter Sebastian, and this is stable number 1, he bellowed. He was a paunchy older man in his 30s, with a moustache. "Note the number of the stall behind you when you are dismissed. This will be your permanent stall to keep clean. A shovel is clipped to the post behind you. You will not be trusted with pitchforks for a few weeks, until we can be sure you can handle them without stabbing the horses. The horse in your stall has been haltered and tied. Take careful note of how the halter fits and how the horse is tied to the ring in the corner of the stall. I will demonstrate it for you once." He disappeared into a stall and re-emerged with a horse in tow. He showed us how to remove and replace the halter and how to tie a quick-release knot on the lead rope. With his demonstration horse now tied, he showed us how to push the horse's body from side to side so we could clean the area under it. I only hoped that all the horses were as easy-going as the demonstration horse. The stable had 23 stalls down one side of a large centre aisle and 23 down the other. The horses were tied with their heads to the wall and their rumps to the centre aisle. The stalls consisted of beams that hung from the ceiling to separate each horse from the one next to it. Only officers' horses had real stalls. 2 wheelbarrows were now pushed into the centre aisle by uniformed soldiers. "When you clean your stalls, bring the manure to the wheelbarrows in the centre aisle, then return the shovel to its attached position on the post," the Obergefreiter instructed. "Anyone whose stall does not pass inspection will be assigned extra duty. Now fall out and clean your stall." I turned and looked at the rump of my new ward. Great, I thought. Now I am going to be Hausfrau to a plough horse. I had never been this close to a live horse before. It obviously outweighed me by at least 1,000 pounds. It seemed impossible that I could move this huge brute by simply pushing it. I hoped it was a tame one as I removed the small, short-handled shovel and entered the stall. I inched nervously toward my target, wondering what one says to reassure a horse. Stretching the short shovel as far as I could reach, I scooped up the offensive pile of manure and retreated hastily to the safety of the centre aisle, depositing the contents of my shovel into the wheelbarrow. To my delight, the horse had simply ignored my presence. Recalling the Obergefreiter's warning about extra duty, I returned to make sure I had left no traces. The horse turned his head to look at me, took a deep breath, and returned to munching hay. I returned my shovel and clipped it securely in place. We were called to attention again, and the Obergefreiter marched us back to the barracks building, where we were informed that we had 1 hour to clean up and have breakfast. After breakfast, Barisel instructed us to form a line with the other recruits in the centre hallway of the barracks, and we were led to another part of the building, where our hair was cut very short. Then we were issued 2 sets of uniforms, one for drill and stable work, and another for everything else. We were also issued riding boots and riding breeches with leather seats, since we were in the horse-drawn artillery. We were especially proud when we were issued steel helmets and cartridge pouches. That made us feel more like real soldiers. They tried to give us the right sizes, but sometimes they could not fit us, and we had to take what they had and exchange it later. Although the first day was busy, it included nothing of real substance, mostly just getting us checked in. Things did not start in earnest until the next day. Following stable duty and breakfast the next day, we were called into formation and introduced to Unteroffizier Max Kroll. He was a very small man of about 23, with dingy blonde hair, a ruddy, scarred face, and pale blue eyes. He stepped up onto a portable platform, took a deep breath, puffed himself up to all the height he could achieve from his 5-foot 4-inch frame, and stared down his now raised nose at us for a long moment of silence. "I am Unteroffizier Kroll," he said finally through clenched teeth. The skin on the back of my neck began to crawl. "It is my responsibility to make soldiers out of the sad specimens I see before me," he gritted. "Obviously they expect miracles of me. But I am going to do it if I have to work you day and night for the next 365 days. From the looks of you, that is what it is going to take." He paused. Then, appearing to draw himself up even straighter, he asked, "How many of you are Abiturienten?" mispronouncing Abitutient, the German word for gymnasium graduate. I raised my hand. I could see Weinreich's hand go up, and I thought I could see 2 others. "Take a good look at me," he growled threateningly. "I plan to take especially good care of Abiturienten." Kroll broke us into squads and turned us over to Obergefreiters, whose styles and attitudes were not much different from his. They went to work on us, assuring us that, labour service notwithstanding, we not only did not know how to march, we did not even know how to walk. Then they went about teaching us in their own way. It was beneath them to recognise our labour service training, so they taught us to march and drill all over again. We were issued rifles and taught how to clean and care for them, as well as how to disassemble and reassemble them. Our instructors disparagingly assured us that we were not carrying spades on our shoulders now. Although we would never have admitted it to our instructors, we were proud to have rifles on our shoulders now instead of spades. In the afternoon, we attended classes on army ranks and on German history before returning to the parade ground for yet more practice and drill. Our training began in earnest the next day with 6 weeks of infantry training. This included handling our rifles, shooting them on the firing range, moving on the ground under fire, and digging in. Of course, that was in addition to marching, drilling, and learning to parade. We kept cadence while marching by singing. We also had training with hand grenades and machine guns. This portion of our training was conducted primarily by Stabsgefreiter Weizsäcker, who made a special point of riding the gymnasium graduates. All we could do was hunker down and endure his abuse. We received only 6 weeks of infantry training, compared with 12 months for the infantry soldiers. It was important, however, because the part of the artillery that accompanied the forward observation officer, called the battery troop, was always up front with the infantry. During this infantry training period, we would get up at 5 o'clock, perform stable duty, have breakfast, fall out, and begin a very full day that ended only when we fell into bed, exhausted, at 10 o'clock. The training was interesting, well planned, and well organised. Lunch was our main meal of the day. The food was good, and it was well prepared. After lunch, we would get 15 minutes or so of rest. Then we would typically change uniforms, the clothing was prescribed for different activities, and get a lecture on espionage or German national history. We stood guard in the stables at night. We had to keep a wheelbarrow handy, and whenever a horse at our end of the stable let something fall, we had to take the wheelbarrow and scoop it up so the horse would not lie down in it. Guard duty was boring and unpleasant, but it was only for 2-hour stretches. We had calisthenics regularly, as well as handball training. The batteries played handball against each other or against nearby infantry. Around December 1st, 1936, we ended our infantry training and began 3 months of basic artillery training. We were divided into 2 groups, those who would handle the horses, usually those from farms, and those who would handle the guns, usually those from the city, although each group had to be familiar with the other's duties. We had to learn everything about the horse side of the business and the gunner's side of the business. Basically, the horse handlers were learning equine care and how to bridle and harness horses. Those of us who were gunners practiced going through the motions of firing. taking the gun off the ammunition cart, placing the gun in the proper position, loading it with a dummy shell and bags of sawdust for powder, aiming it at a fixed point, making corrections and firing on command.